Howdy. Glad to have some of you who've been away. And I don't know where everyone else is.
We're sleeping off that
There were more people at the party than there are in this room right now.
Well, we're party animals.
Yeah, it's a hangover from Gorell's rum cake. Is what we think.
Oh, that was great. Where is she? Oh, that was so good. Delicious. Had this a long time.
Oh, very good. So, some of y'all may have met Nora before, who has just recently moved to Dallas because of her interest in one Kevin Sinclair. But she grew up in Houston at South Main Baptist Church, and so has connections. That's the sister Baptist church, not in our city, kind of deal. And we're so glad to have you with us today. And she has been in New York City, most recently working there. So, and we're glad to have Paul Alloway with us today, sitting right next to Preston.
Jane stopped by and saw us sitting together and said, "This is not going to work."
We have to separate you two. That's
We
awesome.
have to separate you two.
Yeah, well,
The teacher.
Okay. And we'll get to prayer concerns at the end of the lesson, but Marilyn wants you to know she auditioned for a Rocky Horror Show, and she has a callback.
I told her she had to stay out of those bars. She's too old for those fights.
Yeah. We'll talk about that more when we get to our prayer time today. It is warm again, isn't it?
It is. It is. It is.
No, wrong way.
Don't turn it up, please.
It's HOK. It's all the way down here. I've been having issues over.
Trying to find this.
Okay, well, it's hot outside. So Kevin finished, what was that book we were studying? Jude, last week, and I'm grateful for him doing that. And we had a lovely time away in Portland, Oregon, where we were, and last Sunday night we got to have dinner with Britt Carlson. Britt is one of our alumni of the Pastoral Residency Program, and Britt is now an associate pastor, pardon me, at the Portland Mennonite Church.
No.
So, Mennonites, not that much, we're sort of cousins in the faith, right? Because we all come from the Anabaptist tradition. They're just, you may think of Mennonites as pacifists, but very much emphasis on peace, but theologically they're a lot like us because we come from the same roots. And so she's doing well there, and sends her love to all of you. We were really, really glad to get to spend several hours with her and her boyfriend, Ben, who is now living in Portland. Had been there 1 week when we were there, so that was cool. So we got to see her church, and it's a church that was built around the turn of the century.
Oh.
Not the turn of the century we lived through, but the previous turn of the century. And it was originally built for a Friends congregation.
Oh.
Does anyone know the Friends?
Quakers.
The Quakers, right?
Exactly.
And it's a beautiful old building. And like old buildings, it has bizarre little hidden rooms and stuff that she was telling us about. But, pardon me, it has this beautiful stained glass in it. And she said, from history, she's learned that there was a 5-year window of opportunity in which the Quakers believed in stained glass. And this building was built during that window of time.
Oh.
And it has this beautiful stained glass in it that you wouldn't normally find in a Quaker meeting house.
Yeah.
Wow.
But some years ago, they outgrew that space and went off to greater glory and sold the building to the Mennonites, who are in there now. And very, very cool. So anyhow, that's Britt. She's doing well. Our 2 new pastoral residents are beginning work this week. Aaron and Matthew. I think he may go by Matt, actually, more of the time. And they've moved in, we got them settled, and you'll get to know them. Timothy's staying with us as a McKeever Fellow for a while he continues to work on job opportunities, and I've reassured him that we've never let anyone wither yet.
Starved to death.
We've no one's starved to death. Yeah. So.
And they brought twin girls too.
Yeah, the Dodrills have twin girls who are 3, about to turn 4, I believe. Mhm. And Abby is pregnant and is due in November as well. So, yeah. All right. Did you get your ticket?
Where was I supposed to go?
It was at the front desk.
Oh, you didn't tell me.
Well, someone must have gotten. No, it's still there. It's still there for you.
Virginia was,
She has yours.
okay.
The front desk as in,
At the front desk.
Okay.
I'm missing a set though, that someone took too many.
oh,
Yeah, sorry, a little adventure business here. Okay, that's enough of me yakking about things. So our goal for these past months has been to work through the little epistles, the brief epistles. And it has not been brief to do this. There's two, we've sort of been going, there's two I'm going to go back and catch that we missed earlier, Titus and Philemon. And I want to take up Philemon first, because this is the shortest of the two. And some of you laughed at me yesterday when I said at the party that, I think we can knock out Philemon in 1 week. Because it's only 365 words in the entire book.
One for each day of the
You
year.
said that.
One for each, yeah.
Wow.
And I have to say, I went back and was working on the lesson some more after the party, and I thought, no, we're not going to make it through this in 1 week. Maybe two. So I want to tell you a little bit about Philemon. First of all, how many of you have any memory of ever reading or studying Philemon before?
I read it.
Well, you read it every
Study
year.
it.
Okay.
I read it over and over, and I don't buy memory.
You had to look it up. Yeah, so you probably didn't even know how to pronounce it. Right? It's or spell it. Right? So, there's several themes that we're going to get to in this. I want to just sort of introduce today. It's a fascinating little book. So, Philemon is one of the uncontested writings of Paul. So, some of the epistles of Paul in the New Testament, we're not really sure Paul wrote them. It may be that a disciple of Paul or someone wrote in Paul's name, some of them. But this is one that scholars uniformly agree. Paul wrote this letter. Paul probably wrote this letter from Ephesus to this man named Philemon, who was living in Colossae, as in Colossians. And so we think it's even possible that this little letter and the book we know as Colossians both went at the same time to Colossae. Probably carried by a character in this little letter named Onesimus. Now, it doesn't spell all this out, but there's good historical reference to cause us to believe that Onesimus had been a slave of Philemon and had run away, probably to Ephesus, where somehow, through the mysteries of relationships, he met Paul. And not only did he meet Paul, Paul the evangelist converted him. He became a believer. This runaway slave became a believer under Paul's tutelage, and they discover that they have a mutual friend in Philemon. Right? But they both know Philemon. And Paul then interjects himself to try to bring reconciliation between Philemon and his family and Onesimus, the runaway slave. And so the little letter called Philemon was originally written to Philemon and his family to try to work out a solution on the problem of Onesimus. This is a fascinating little bit of biblical history, and we'll talk about some of the ramifications of that here in just a moment. So, first I want to talk about slavery in this context. And I'm going to read some highlights from PBS did a program on Roman slavery in the past, and this is not like from a Bible commentary. This is from PBS. Slavery in ancient Rome differed from the modern forms of slavery that we may have known because it was not based on race. It was abusive, it was degrading, and it was cruel, but it really was not a race-based thing the way we have known slavery. There was a long history of slavery in the ancient world, and it had been practiced, as you know, in ancient Egypt and in Greece. So during the Roman Empire, most slaves were foreigners, and unlike in modern times, slavery, again, was not based on race. So the slaves in Rome might have included prisoners of war, sailors captured and sold by pirates, or slaves who were bought outside Roman territory and brought in. In hard times economically, it was not uncommon for desperate Roman citizens to raise money by selling their children into slavery. Hard to imagine for us, right? All slaves and their families were the property of their owners who could sell them or rent them out at any time. Their lives were harsh. They were often whipped, branded, or cruelly mistreated. Their owners could kill them for any reason and would face no punishment. So even though Romans accepted slavery as a norm, there were some people, like the poet Seneca, who argued that slaves should at least be treated fairly if you're going to have slaves. Slaves worked everywhere, a lot of times in private homes. They worked in mines and in factories and on farms. They worked for city governments. Think about this. They worked for city governments and on engineering projects such as the roads, aqueducts, and buildings. And so a different thing about Roman slavery is slaves merged easily into the population. In fact, slaves looked so similar to Roman citizens that the Roman Senate at one time considered a plan to make them wear special clothing so that they could be identified at a glance. The idea was rejected because the Senate feared that if slaves saw how many of them there were working in Rome, they might be tempted to join forces and rebel. So it's best to keep it a secret with that, all right? Another unique thing about Roman slavery is it was possible to be released from slavery. You could be freed. Roman owners freed their slaves in considerable numbers. Some just freed them outright. Others allowed them to buy their own freedom. So this possibility of gaining freedom helped slaves to be obedient and hardworking and to rebel less. So the other thing that we need to know about Roman slavery is it was such a critical, taken for granted part of the Roman culture that no one could have imagined life without it. No one could have imagined how the economy, much like the American South, you know, one of the arguments against slavery, one of the arguments for slavery in the American South was, well, the economy will collapse, right? More so here, it was impossible to imagine how all this stuff would get done. And so, when we read in Philemon about what's going on with Onesimus, keep in mind that we've got to read this not from our 21st century knowledge about slavery and our abhorrence of it, but we're going to have to get ourselves in the mindset of Philemon and Onesimus and Paul as we do this. So, Why does all this matter? I'm going to tell you the end of the story at the beginning because I think it'll help craft the conversation we have over the next couple of weeks. Sarah Rudin wrote a book called Paul Among the People, and she argues, for example, that in this letter, Paul created our Western conception of the individual human being who is unconditionally precious to God and therefore entitled to the consideration of other human beings. So she's making the case that out of this little book of Philemon, we get the Christian notion of individual worth of all people. Before Paul, she says, a slave was subhuman and entitled to no more consideration than an animal. There's one point of view. On the other hand, there's another author named Dimaid McCullough who wrote a book called A History of Christianity, and he called this little epistle a Christian foundation document in the justification of slavery.
Wow.
That you could also take this little letter and use it to justify slavery. So here's one author who says this is an end-all to slavery, and another author who reads the same letter and says this can be used as justification for slavery. An important thing about reading Philemon is that the early Christian community included slaves, slaveholders, and non-slaveholders. But Christians were distinguished from other people not by their country or their ethnicity or their customs, but they were distinguished by the faith that called them to look for life beyond this life in heaven. Now, another interesting thing about Philemon. Do y'all remember Pope Benedict? Mm-hmm. One pope ago, right? Short-term pope. So he published an encyclical that talked about the power of Christianity in transforming society. And he referenced Philemon in that encyclical. Here's what he said. Those who, as far as their civil status is concerned, stand in relation to one another as masters and slaves, inasmuch as they are members of the one church, have become brothers and sisters. This is how Christians address one another. Even if external structures remain unaltered, this changed society from within. When the letter to the Hebrews says that Christians here on earth do not have a permanent homeland, but seek one which lies in the future, this does not mean for one moment that they live only for the future. Present society is recognized by Christians as an exile. They belong to a new society which is the goal of their common pilgrimage and which is anticipated in the course of that pilgrimage. So what Benedict was saying here, and remember that Benedict was a conservative pope, right?
Oh, yeah.
Not like Francis,
No.
who we have now. What he was saying is, in the book, in the letter to the Hebrews, and in the little epistle of Philemon, we see biblical evidence that restrictive, evil structures of society can be changed from the inside out through the power of the church. That it's the witness of Christians, even in the first century, behaving in a different way that causes the powers of this world to crumble. Well, now that's an encouraging thought, I think. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
On this? So I'm going to pause here. What questions do you have at what I've said about slavery in the first century Roman world? Are we up to speed? I'm laying the bricks here for when we get to the rest of this. All right? Let's read Philemon. There's only one chapter to Philemon. And what we're going to try to accomplish today is verses 1 through 7. Preston's laughing already. Would someone volunteer to read for us verses 1 through 7? Have a reader. Surely will. All right.
Paul, a prisoner for Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our beloved fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God always when I remember you in my prayers, because I hear of your love and of the faith that you have toward the Lord Jesus and for all the saints. And I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective for the full knowledge of every good thing that is in us for the sake of Christ. For I have derived much joy and comfort from your love, my brother, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you.
Thank you. All right, a couple of housekeeping matters. It helps when you're reading something to understand who the characters are. We've talked about Philemon. We don't know a lot about who he is, except that we know he's a slaveholder. We know from what we read in this letter that he was a businessman. We know that he had some standing in the community. We know that he was apparently successful at whatever it is that he did. We know that he hosted a church in his house. And that's referenced here in verse 2. The common understanding in verse 2 is that Apphia is the wife of Philemon, and that Archippus is the son of Philemon and Apphia, and that Paul has known all of them. And so notice that this letter is written by Paul, but also it's from Timothy. So both Paul and Timothy know this family and are writing to them in this manner because probably Philemon it's possible that Philemon had been converted by Paul's preaching somewhere along the way as well. All right? So do you have a grasp on who the main characters are now? You understand the players here? All right. Let's see. Make sure I said everything. It's possible that Archippus, who the likely son here, is the same person mentioned in Colossians 4:17, which would make sense if Colossians and Philemon were written about the same time and carried by the same messenger. Okay? That's just a little Bible connected dots for you. I want to focus for a few minutes on the end of verse 2, where Paul says that there's a church that meets in the house of Philemon. It's easy for us to forget that the early church was all built on house churches. There were no big churches like we know today. Why was that? They would have been killed. Yeah, it was illegal. Right? One of the problems with modernity is we tend to look back with nostalgia within Christianity on the house church movement of the early church, as though that were the gold standard for the way the church ought to be today. And you'll hear this sometimes. Preston, you probably heard this along the way, that the big church as we know today is not biblical. Well, I think you have a hard time making that case because the primary reason there were not public churches in the first century is because they would have all been killed, imprisoned at least, right? Look what happened to Paul. And so you've got to think more like China on this, even though things are changing in China. But you have a huge house church movement that has been the underground church in China for years now. Is that to say that house churches are evil and unnecessary? No. There are many benefits to small church gatherings. But what I want to argue against is the notion that sometimes gets out there that the only valid back to the basics form of church is a house church. There was a reason that it was that way, okay? And if you understand other social organizations during the first century, you would know that they were not all based in homes. There were other large gatherings that would be equivalent to church, they just weren't church, right? And certainly in the Jewish tradition, there were already temples and synagogues along the way. So the first record that we have of a house church in Christianity is in Acts chapter 1, verse 13. Let's see. Yeah. Christians continued to meet in homes all the way up until the that would be the 300s, would be the 4th century. Stop doing the math on that, right? And it was when the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Now, he may have done it for the wrong reasons and all that, but nonetheless, it happened in AD 313. And at that point, church buildings began to multiply. Another thing happened in the 16th and early 17th centuries with the Reformation that fostered new churches as Protestants built their own places of worship as well. So there's an ongoing thread throughout Christian history of churches meeting in homes. There's also a long history of churches being in their own places and larger buildings and larger assemblies like this. Cody?
I live in the small part of Lake Highlands down on almost to the police station on Northwest Highway. And on my street are 5 Watermark families. And that's what, as far as I can understand, is a
They have a home gathering.
And it is more, as I understand, that they meet for church, or what we call big church, or but their biblical teachings at our Sunday school is in the homes. And
Right, so this is a
small,
very common thing
and
in
they
the
all
non-denominational churches.
They all host a group. They all have
Right.
different groups.
Home groups.
Yes.
You'll hear, so this has been a sort of a resurgence of this idea that goes along with the corporate worship experience. So I'm camping out on this one little odd phrase in here, but we don't often get a chance to talk about the sociology of some of this and the history, and I thought it might be interesting to pause and help you have some context on that. Helen?
But would it also be that in the first portion of Christianity, they were still expecting Christ to come back immediately, so there would have been no purpose in building a building that was going to last for hundreds of years, because they didn't expect to be there.
Yeah, certainly. Even if you could have built a cathedral, you wouldn't have built a cathedral, right? Harriet?
I think we've lost track of the fact that this is the beginning of a faith, and there just weren't that many people either. They were
That's right.
gathering them in, and that was where it started, as most places do.
Excellent point. Again, I think we tend to romanticize the early church. And not only that, we tend to think of them a lot more like us than they probably were. Because very different culture. Does that mean that we have fallen away? No. Think of any enduring organization, even Judaism itself, that predates us. I mean, they started in a tent. There were no synagogues. There was a tabernacle, right? And this is the natural progression of things. And I love this point about that Helen made about the early church thought Christ was returning immediately, right? And if you're a cathedral builder, you are investing in something you will not see completely, right? Yeah, I have a good funeral sermon on cathedral builders. Let me know if you want to use that for you. Okay.
Now, some of our CBF missionaries are in a situation
Yes.
where they can, I mean, in like Morocco and places like that, where they cannot let it be known that they are Christians.
So Kathy's right. This is within Christianity around the world.
Right now.
It is very common in difficult places, much like the early Roman Empire, where it is not safe to be gathering as we do on a Sunday morning, where house churches are indeed the norm there. So, as you read this letter of Philemon, though, think about the fact it's referenced to Philemon and his family and to the church in your house.
Mhm.
So the letter ultimately is to be read to everyone. But when you keep in mind, this is not 500 people. It's not 1,000 people. This is the small number of people that meet together in a house. So it's a much more intimate setting that this is going to come through in. Questions about that before we move on? Everyone up to speed on house church now?
I mean, I think it's also significant that Paul calls his son a soldier, because that's what they were. I mean, they were engaged in, you know, non-direct battle.
Good, yes.
The Jews, the ark was created to be mobile. It had the poles on either side,
Yeah.
so they could transport.
True. So I want to back up to verse 1 for a minute to talk about the point that Ben just made. There are a couple of key words in here. So when Paul talks about Archippus being a fellow soldier, he's using military language to refer to the church, right? This is long before the hymn "Onward Christian Soldiers" was written. That's an important point. But back in verse 1, Paul refers to himself as a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Some of your translations may say a prisoner for Jesus Christ. And this is one of those things, when you translate Greek into English, those little connecting words, sometimes you have to imply what they are. Now, it's likely Paul actually was a prisoner at the time he wrote this. It's possible. We don't know the exact year in here. But more than that, Paul portrays himself as a prisoner of the Lord, which is language he uses elsewhere in what we would call the prison letters of his. Being imprisoned for Paul was a sign of faithfulness to God's call. He was saying this as a positive, not as a negative. And it causes me to ask, okay, Paul, isn't this sort of bragging? Are you sort of calling attention to the fact that you're persecuted here? Does Paul really have a sort of, let's say he has a persecution complex going on here? How should we compare Paul to the times today when Christians seem to glory in saying they're persecuted? What's the difference? I mean, there's a lot of Christians in America today who feel like they have been persecuted for years.
Send them overseas.
So I think one of the differences is Paul really was persecuted. I mean, genuinely, honestly, it's not that he couldn't take over the school and say the prayer that he wants to say, right? That's not persecution. And I think one of the great problems of the modern church is we have redefined persecution to be something other than what the New Testament certainly knows for it to be.
Hypersensitivity.
And privilege.
Well, what about now? Like I'm a prisoner of my faith. I mean, I'm not gonna go be Jewish, or I'm not gonna go be Catholic.
So this is a wonderful. So you are a prisoner of your faith, and that's exactly the message Paul wants to get across.
I think that's what I feel.
Yeah, that you are. Paul would say he is held captive by his faith.
Yeah, I think that's where
And that's the positive of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
That's important because Paul is saying, I am captivated by what the Lord Jesus has called me to do. Now, there's a peril in that as well. And I'm going to show my own biases out of this. I know you're shocked. Because it's easy to run across Christians, not just today, but throughout most of the time, I think, who justify whatever it is they're doing or wanting to do or how their thoughts or whatever by saying, well, I'm just a prisoner of the Lord. I'm bound by what the Lord has told me to do. And maybe you think what the Lord's told them to do is crazy, right? Or it doesn't line up or whatever. And we hear this. How do we evaluate Paul and us and them against this standard? If we agree it's a good thing to be a prisoner to the Lord, held captive by the demands of the Lord, who gets to determine what the sentence is?
Pray it's good.
Right? Helen?
Isn't that ironic that, that Jesus is sending different messages to different people? They interpret
is Jesus
things.
really sending different
But they
messages?
interpret things very differently. I mean, I'm speaking from my own filters. It's the Zapruder film.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, because, you know, I'm a JFK guy. Both the conspiracy and the one shot, people use the same piece of evidence to prove their own points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that ironic.
It's how you receive the interpretation.
Yeah.
Right? And this is one of those things that on the scriptural side, Zapruder film side, we may not know the reality until that great and glorious day when we stand before God. But we're accountable for what we know right now. This is the best I can say on that. Someone else with a thought on this? How do we get around this? Do you see the problem? Kathy, you look vexed.
I am. A little bit. So my takeaway on the prisoner of your faith thing is I would put that more in terms for myself of back to that prevenient grace thing that probably I shouldn't be talking about, you know, at Wilshire, but that God's great grace attracting all of us, and you find yourself in a position in your faith, which for other people could be a different lens of faith, whether it's Catholicism or Judaism or something else, in which suddenly your openness and God's attractiveness come together in equal measures to put you exactly in the right place for God's message and for your actions.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
That's how I see that. Not so much like the negative concept of being a prisoner, or I don't have to think anymore, or I can't get out of this, or my boundaries are completely closed off. But I wandered into the right space of God's attractiveness that is always there anyway. The door is open, I walked in.
There's a lovely psalm, I can't remember the number. There's a line in one of the psalms that says, in the King James, "My lines have fallen in pleasant places." My lines have fallen in pleasant places. And I think that's what you're saying as well. Harriet?
Also, we have free choice to be where we are. But that attraction is alive and it never goes away. You have chosen this, but you are bound by silk cords, we can put it that way.
Also, you are choosing this,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yes.
We can relate that to our significant other if we have one, that we are so captivated by that person that we don't want to get away.
Mark, I think
Good.
some of it is the different Bibles, whether it's King James or Revised, and as Preston says, my almost Bible, the Living Bible. Sometimes, but it says.
They're worse.
Well, he said in the Living Bible, it says in jail. It
Right.
specifically says in jail for preaching the good news about Jesus Christ. And that, so it says that. And then on the part about the soldier, I can't say his name, the son, who like myself is a soldier of the cross.
Yes.
So you think maybe I mean, I know the word soldier is battle and and everything, and they did battle. They
Well,
didn't.
the reference here is someone who's committed to the cause.
Right.
Right? Someone who's committed to the cause. Think of that in terms of the Salvation Army.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it called an army? Well, it's the same idea, right? It's not because they are out fighting people. It's because they're a band.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the musical sense, even though I'm getting down a little
And that rhymes with T.
Thank you, Professor Harold Hill. But now, here's the main point I want to make about this word prisoner. Paul is very smart. And Paul is writing this letter to Philemon to make a very difficult request of him. Because what he's ultimately going to be asking Philemon and his family to do is to welcome back Onesimus, the runaway slave. And Philemon had every right under Roman law to kill him. And Paul is trying to, he would say elsewhere in his writings, show a more excellent way through this, right?
So the prisoner reference isn't a boastful, it's a, I'm in this with you, I have to make
He's
different
identifying
decisions.
himself
He's laying
as a
a
slave.
foundation,
Right.
right, to
That's,
help.
that's exactly what I think he's doing.
Oh, yeah. It's a setup.
It's a setup.
It's a setup. That, you can tell. It's just a,
The whole thing,
it's a con.
I mean, you know, when you're a smart kid and you're trying to prepare your parent for the ask that you're going to make, right? You know, you wind up with the praise and you say the right things to sort of, we call it buttering up.
There's a television ad about a teenage boy who's coming in to tell his parents about the accident he had. And it is a butter-up job.
In the very nicest of ways, that's what Paul is doing here with this. So he's trying to create an identity. So any of you who work in sales, you know how this works. If you can identify with the person and they can identify with you, you're going to have a better connection, right? All right. Now back to verse 3. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We may just read through this very fast and move on, because it seems so much like every letter in the New Testament, right? But I think we need to pause and remember that even though this looks like an obligatory salutation, like, have a good day, we say that all the time, right? It's really, in the early church, much more than that, because every word in this phrase has important meaning. We read it over and over in Paul's letters and in the letters of others, and the same words come about. Why is that? Grace to you, peace to you, and the acknowledgement that these things come from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ to us. I think in this we have a mindset of the fundamental idea and identity of the early church. What they were about was bringing grace and peace to people within the fellowship. That's fundamental. It's so fundamental that it's spoken every time a letter is written. And this would be unique among Christian writings, not true of other Roman era writings. What do you think about this common refrain that we find in the New Testament epistles? Do you find comfort in this? Is it helpful to you?
Well, and I think that word peace, if you look that up, it implies prosperity. And so, again, if you look at it like Paul's, setting this up, and he's writing this to a businessman, he's saying, in what we follow, prosperity is more than just money. That true prosperity comes through this grace, through other things besides just having money. And so I'm going to give you back this slave, which you see as money, but what I'm telling you, I think there's more than that. You know?
Yeah. There's a beautiful line, oh dear, where do I have this? One of the commentators I read, oh, here it is. Paul wrote with a quill dipped in the inkwell of grace. Isn't that a beautiful line? I wish I'd written that.
You could have.
Paul wrote with a quill dipped in the inkwell of grace.
No
And it's-
one will ever say that again, because we don't have
Quills.
quills.
we don't have quills.
And the idea that my computer is sending to you grace and peace, no.
Not quite the same,
Not
is it?
quite the same, huh?
Yeah, something's lost in translation, Preston, I agree. But isn't there a lesson for us in that as well? Isn't there some lesson for us in the model of Paul? And we think of Paul as an abrasive person a lot of times. But we see this tenderness, this pastoral side in Paul as well. And particularly in this case where he's got to thread the needle on this one. Very, very carefully. And the reality is he doesn't have to. He's chosen to. He does not have to get involved in this. But for the sake of all that's right and holy, he's decided to, right? But he's going to do it in the most graceful way he possibly can. I am encouraged by that. I hope you are as well. All right. Well, let's stop after verse 3 so that we have time to do our prayer concerns. See, I thought I'd get through 7 verses and we got
Back to grace, every time I hear somebody say grace and peace to you, I think about by grace are you saved, it's God's grace to us that we're here. So it has a fuller meaning than just saying, I hope you're okay, you know, or have a good day.
Yeah. Any of you, any Game of Thrones fans in here? No, just a couple. So I think of this every time, particularly in season 6, when the people who follow the 7 gods of Game of Thrones, 7 blessings. It's their salutation every time they're right. And this is a make-believe world of make-believe gods and all that, but the concept is so pervasive that from culture to culture you get salutations like this. And it's easy to take them for granted and just let it go in one ear and out the other, but the words really do matter. They're enduring for a reason.
I think especially in the context of the times, not a lot of grace and peace amongst the Romans.
No.
The God in the Old Testament, you would argue also not a lot of grace and peace.
True.
I've always been a watcher of the Borgias, and I just keep thinking what Paul's church became.
Yes. Okay, so Dave, we'll pick up next week at verse 4.
Maybe 3 weeks.
I'm embarrassed to say verse 4. Verse 4.
Well, scheduled for a year and a half, right?
I hope this was a helpful discussion.
You laid the foundation, that was good.
Okay. If I'm going too slow, y'all just need to tell me sometime.
No.
We'll move forward. Well, thanks to everyone who's joined us on the live stream. We'll cut away from there now.